Maybe it's because you're licking those banisters. That's how you've acquired.
I've built up immunity.
Yeah, no, it was right. Serbian. It's Serbian immunity. It was the fantastic food that you were fucking complaining about. It was the rakia that you drank.
Jordan Peterson did
I'm not sure that Serbian immunity works in The Hague, but
I see now. Well, hey, it worked for Jordan Peterson, and it worked for you because you didn't.
It works for me too.
Yeah, there you go.
I'm afraid to leave, and then it'll like leave me. Yeah.
It works for Djokovic as well. Maybe.
That's true.
Maybe.
We'll
see.
Okay.
You don't like Djokovic, I guess, Alex, because you're also like Federer, like a Swiss Euro trash, right?
I mean, just not Southwestern Euro trash. I don't know. Central Middle Europe and Middle European trash, I guess.
The worst kind of Euro trash. Actually, not exactly the worst kind of Euro trash. The worst kind of Euro trash are the Euro trash we're going to be talking about with you, Lily.
That's right.
Too, but I think
German Greens.
German green pedophiles, I think, probably are the worst kind of Euro trash, to be fair.
Should we get started? We're gonna. So we'll go through, and we'll start with the pedophiles, and then we'll go on to war. Which sounds like one of our usual outlines. That's how we normally start. Pedophiles first, then war, and then the future. Does that sound good? Okay.
Great.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to BungaCast, the global politics podcast at the end of history. I'm Alex Hochuli. It's Thursday, the 13th of January, and I'm joined as usual by a man who misses all of the shots he doesn't take and quite a couple of the ones he does, George Hoare. Hi, George.
Wow, what an introduction. Thanks.
Yep. Joined by one of a small handful of men who describe themselves as the last Marxist, and maybe stay tuned to see if they fight to the death to find out who truly is the last one. Philip Cunliffe.
The last true Marxist, but thank you for the introduction.
And we're delighted to welcome back for, the second, third time? And it should be more often, really. Lily Lynch. Hello.
Hi, thank you guys very much.
How's Belgrade?
It's good. Never a dull moment. Pretty well. How are you guys?
Good. Hey, tell us, Lily, while we got you on the line, is there anything happening in Belgrade over Djokovic? Beyond the general kind of press hullabaloo, is there anything a bit more is it being talked about on the street, in the cafes, that kind of thing?
I think it's the only thing people were talking about. You didn't hear a single thing about the weather, about the snow, and it's quite snowy outside, and people were just completely consumed by Djokovic, even non-sports fans, because people really saw their own experiences with borders as Serbs traveling the world, and especially in the West in that story.
And there's quite a lot in Australia, isn't there? I know there's quite a lot of Croatians, but I imagine yes. Serbs as well, yeah?
Yeah, there are, yeah.
Same difference anyway.
Oh, that's interesting. That's interesting to hear. And do you think presumably also it'll be a boost to vax skepticism in Serbia as well, his kind of new age stance on the issue? Yes. Yeah. I think there's a lot of vaccine skepticism here already. There is, as you kind of can expect, there's a lot of kind of esoteric beliefs and interest in healing, natural healing and no GMOs. That kind of thing. But I would say that even people who are vaccinated, kind of adopted a contrarian, and, support for his decision, I guess, just because there's a sort of kind of defiance in it that it's very Serbian. Yeah, it certainly is. Yeah, so that pretty much confirms everything that I imagined was going on. So.
So, it's actually quite apposite. We were going to be talking about weird hippie remedies. Well, maybe remedies isn't the right word, but let me just.
It's definitely not the right word. But yes.
But actually, before we go any further, I should say, and I'm going to say this at the end as well, but people should sign up to Lily's Patreon. It's patreon.com/Lily S. Lynch. And we're going to be talking about a couple of things she's written on there, specifically about a group that's, I guess, marked by its lust for war. by its lust for children and its lust for the planet, and that is the German Greens. And it's a good moment to talk about them. It is a good moment for Lily to have written about them because they're back in power. They're the junior partner in the traffic light coalition in Germany. They have 5 ministries, including the vice chancellor and the foreign minister. And of course, if you're not aware, they're in a coalition with the Social Democrats and the neoliberal Free Democrats, though arguably they're all just different shades of neoliberalism. Maybe we can come back to that. One of the interesting things in tracking the history of the Greens is to see their transformation into a mainstream pro-capitalist party that embraced war in the late 90s and the market, but with a lot of kind of feel-good vibes attached. I've said this on the podcast before, and I'm going to repeat it. It's a great tweet by Julia Damphouse, who, if she's listening, hi, Julia, which is the only truly universal law of political science is that leftists always think that the Green Party in their country is particularly bad and neoliberal, but that the Green Party of some other country is decent. In parentheses, it isn't, and the leftists there think the same thing. I think that's really good. I think it's very appropriate because if you have harbor any illusions as to the quality of Green parties elsewhere, you're wrong. They're just as bad as the Greens where you are. Well, I guess we should just jump into the first theme, which is pedophiles and the pedophiles association with Greens, which sounds crazy, but this is all, I guess, part of the long tail of 1968 and the whole radicalism associated with that moment. The Greens, it's worth saying, they were founded formally in 1980 and formed around 4 pillars of social justice, ecological wisdom, grassroots democracy, and nonviolence. And then they were in government, of course, from 1998 to 2005. But before this period, before their entry into power and becoming increasingly mainstream, there were some groups associated with the Greens who described themselves as pedosexuals. I'm going to let Lily explain what is this history?
Well, it kind of grows out of 1968 and the whole kind of ideology of anti-authoritarianism. And this psychoanalyst, Wilhelm Reich's work, he was kind of the main kind of this guy who was cited, a disciple of Freud, an Austrian kind of communist. He wrote The Mass Psychology of Fascism, and he believed that families are authoritarian, the kind of nuclear family, and that he also believed that the suppression of child sexuality is authoritarian. And so this is kind of where a lot of this kind of early flirtation with pedophilia kind of begins with the Greens, a lot of these guys who began as student activists. And so there was both a kind of an activism component, and then that grew into a kind of a communal kindergarten movement in the 70s. And that's where one of the main kind of figureheads of the Greens, he remains so today, Daniel Cohn-Bendit, he's French-German. He was Danny the Red in 1968, a kind of real like student leader. He worked in one of these anti-authoritarian kindergartens, and he wrote very kind of graphic descriptions of like sexual contact with a 5-year-old girl it's kind of very shocking and disturbing to read now. Just we can't really even imagine that ever being considered something like liberatory or. And so, but just to back up a little bit, sorry. Part of the reason I think this like idea around pedophilia and like sexual liberation really took off is because this is the generation after the Nazis who are trying to kind of who are looking for explanations for why their parents didn't rebel, basically. And so this really kind of took on had some attractions, to put it in a kind of terrible way, this idea that like sexuality could kind of liberate the nation from these restrictive kind of confines that had led them to fascism, to Nazism. So that's kind of the beginning of it.
Very intriguingly, also there were ex-Nazis in the party too. And I found this the whole thing was just a kind of a fascinating read, not only for the kind of everything about it is kind of so weird and shocking and, like a time capsule from another era, which it is, I suppose, but also the combinations like green, Nazi, pedophiles. It's like 3 of the things that I think everyone is entitled to legitimately hate. And they're all together like in one package. Astonishing.
Exactly. That's absolutely right. I mean, there was I wrote a separate like standalone article just on this Nazi pedophile, very prolific pedophile, who was one of the kind of founding members of the Greens, who was their oldest member. He was in their commercials, a very kind of famous Green Party commercial ahead of their 1980 elections, and it turned out that he was, indulging in sex with very, very young children, again around 5, 6, 7, in these communes that were also affiliated with the Green Party, where you had local Green Party leaders who were kind of the directors of the communes, and then the children living in those communes, those are kind of street kids living in these communes, they would then come to Green Party events and speak and carry posters that said, children's rights. And it was kind of presented, pedophile rights were presented as children's rights, a child's right to choose who they have sex with, who they live with. And I
mean, well, one of the things that struck me is that I'm trying to, I like Wilhelm Reich. I mean, I think The Mass Psychology of Fascism is still a brilliant book. And so I'm trying to spare him the tar of the pedophile brush. But I think the reality is that there is a certain logic there in terms of the role that sexual repression plays, the repression of like childhood sexuality, and the kind of punitive kind of superego that creates, and that manifests itself socially and so on. So there's a logic there, and its association with authoritarianism. I guess what's striking here is that it seems like just a lot of sexual liberation and not a lot of other liberation. Like it's kind of I mean that in the sense that doesn't seem to be really like creating a new type of society. It's just pursuing these kind of liberated sexual mores within the same capitalist society, I guess. Or maybe I'm reading history backwards. Maybe there was a deeper radicalism there, but like that's what struck me reading your pieces.
And I think that's also, it's a good criticism of what the Green Party evolved into. I mean, I guess we'll get to that later. I guess the only real attempt to kind of putting Reich's like attitudes about childhood sexuality into like some kind of practice were these anti-authoritarian kindergartens, where it was believed like the next generation of Germans could be instructed or not instructed. They actually were against any kind of, they're anti-pedagogical. Sorry, thank you.
Pro pedophilia, but anti-pedagogy.
Yeah, anti-pedagogy. Yeah, exactly. And so the idea was that in these anti-authoritarian kindergartens, they would kind of be deprogrammed. They would be de-Germanified, or however you put that. So they would be not instructed. I don't know how you put it, but they would be. Yeah, they would have a different kind of hands-on education. It's really
facilitated, perhaps, or
yes.
Or encouraged or something like that. But those kind of neoliberal buzzwords of empowerment.
Yeah.
Empowered. There you go. Empowered.
I mean, that's still quite a prevalent educational philosophy today. Well, there's some parts of it. The idea that you kind of let children discover things. It's actually, it's kind of oppressive to actually tell them things or to transfer knowledge. Instead, just let them just find out themselves. It's in their brains, and they can discover it through play. I mean, I should say that's the contemporary philosophy of education. I think some of the other elements which were mixed in here are probably not quite so prevalent. But I did actually have a question on, I guess, the initial appeal of some of these ideas. I mean, was it as straightforward as essentially saying that this 68 generation, they explained their parents' adherence to Nazism because they were just too repressed, they were too rule following. So essentially any kind of libertarian impulse, any liberation is the more the better, because like it can't be as bad as being a Nazi.
I think that must have been it, like just a really like terrible overcorrection. I mean, I think that's one good interpretation. Yeah.
Yeah, but what is fascinating is precisely this kind of reckoning with authoritarianism, like intellectual reckoning with it, at the same time as they like allow these ex-Nazis in. I mean, that's what's so completely perverse about it.
Just to pick up on two threads. So, could you tell us a bit more about Daniel Cohn-Bendit, Danny the Red's kind of how he, because this story kind of resurfaced. So he this was published. it resurfaced, and he defended himself from the claims that he was sexually abusing or molesting the children in his care at the time. So I was wondering if you could just tell us a bit, just in terms of the historical record of like what, the context in which the claims resurfaced and how he defended himself. But then also, if you could tell us a bit about the Nazi or the former Nazi who fronted the Greens propaganda in the 1980s, if you could tell us a bit about what his role during the Nazi era was, what he'd done in the party, that kind of thing.
Sure. Well, to go back to Daniel Cohn-Bendit, so he wrote that passage that I described to you, not in any detail, but about the 5-year-old girl in the kindergarten, that he worked in a kindergarten for 2 years. And then there's actually a second time where he described, again, sexual contact with like a kindergarten-age little girl on a talk show, on a German talk show in 1982, I believe. And this is a whole, paragraph length transcript of that. And again, I don't think anybody really batted an eyelash at the time, but then it came up again about a decade later. Sorry. I need to look at that. I need to find that year. I'm sorry. That was 2001. Yeah, 2001. Apologies. The passages resurfaced then because Bettina Roll, she was the daughter of Ulrike Meinhof from the Red Army faction. She leaked them to the media, along with photos of Joschka Fischer beating a police officer, engaged in violence against a police officer. And there's a lot of debate as to why she did that. One interpretation that I read was that she kind of felt that these kind of former radicals who'd gone on to have great careers in the German government, kind of sold her mom out, and that the true radicals died in prison. And then there was also the interpretation that she was angry about their support for the war in Serbia, or some combination of those two things. So either way, she leaked those things to the media, and Daniel Cohn-Bendit said exactly kind of what you said. He said that these were not representations of anything that actually happened. I don't understand his explanation, because I don't think there's anything funny about. I think he said something like, "Oh, it was entertainment," or that he was trying to imagine Reich's teachings, but these didn't reflect an actual contact that he had with a little girl.
Sorry, it was a bit like OJ saying, here's how I would have done it. I didn't do it, but here's how. Here's what I would have done.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay.
I think that the part that was a little bit hard for people to understand is the fact that he, years later in the early 80s, also kind of talked about this. The contact with the little girl was supposed to have happened in the late 70s, or he wrote about it in the late 70s. And then in 1982, he was on this talk show where he again talked about the sexual contact, very graphic, with a 5-year-old girl. And so he basically successfully defended himself publicly. I think that part of the reason why his kind of spin on it was so successful is that Germany does tend to have much more kind of I don't want to say permissive, but say more their treatment of pedophiles. If you look into Germany's kind of philosophy about that, it tends to be much kind of more compassionate and liberal, than what we at least than what exists in the U.S. Also, I think that there were just so many people who had these views during the late 60s and 70s, and these anti-authoritarian kindergartens were just kind of such a feature of Berlin. There's whole neighborhoods like Kreuzberg in Berlin were just had storefronts that were turned into kindergartens. And so for whatever reason, his apology, or not, he did apologize, and he said that I'm not into kids, or I was never into kids. That wasn't my thing. I was there for other reasons. It kind of insinuated that he had a good time, but not with kids. He continued and had obviously a very successful career, and he's still in the public eye. He still comments all over the place on politics in France. He's kind of taken it upon himself to either condemn or support, as the voice of 1968, protest movements. He'll say like the yellow vests are authoritarian, so they're bad and they don't have the spirit of 68 or whatever. He'll that kind of thing. So yeah,
it's a good kind of career move, becoming the voice of a generation, the spirit of 68, keeper of the flame.
Right, Danny the Green now, and he's always I think he advises conversation with Macron, like he has some kind of advisory capacity. I need to fact check that, but he certainly speaks positively of him. I was just reading him, kind of condemning the yellow vests for having like authoritarian tendencies, and speaking very glowingly of Macron. So
authoritarian because they're not fiddling with kids, I guess. But so,
or indeed sending in the riot cops against the yellow vests,
right. That's democratic. Sorry, respecting democracy.
That's fascinating. So your read of it then is that too much of a can of worms for people to look to kind of challenge him any further on that episode, given the prevalence of these anti-authoritarian kind of practices throughout German society in that era.
I also have another interpretation, which is that, I think that the media in Germany, in the European liberal press in general, is very sympathetic to the Greens. It's incredibly sympathetic, to the point of it being a little bit, it's actually probably one of the things that really prompted me to want to write about them, is when I see like one politician or political party receiving this sort of, almost like absurd, like effusive praise by supposedly neutral media personalities or media outlets. It makes me want to like dig and like what's going on behind all this. And so I think that they are absolutely the beneficiaries. Cohn-Bendit, but also other Greens who wrote, PhDs in defense of pedophilia. There's a bunch of other like slightly less prominent figures, but certainly also equally as positive towards pedophilia. I just think that they made themselves very, very important for the powerful people, and they lent a lot of kind of moral credibility, and we'll talk about that more later as we get into the late 90s with the Kosovo War. Yeah. But certainly they had a lot of a very sympathetic press. And in my opinion, when I started digging into the pedophilia part of the story, I was shocked, because what you kind of first come across, the first kind of results that you get in, say, Google, if you're just going to Google it, certainly you see some pretty like upsetting stuff, but you do not even scratch the surface of the extent to which this was really like something that was a part of mainstream Green discussions and efforts to repeat. That's another thing that I need to mention. There's a paragraph in the German penal code that outlawed pedophilia, and that a big part of the German Greens kind of activism in the 80s was about repealing that. At least that was a mainstream position that a lot of Greens held, and it was not fully removed from the Greens agenda until the mid 90s, from what I understand.
Yeah, so I mean, actually, I wanted to come on to that because
first of all, I wanted to hear about the Green Nazi as well.
Oh yeah, yeah. Sorry that I'm jumping all over the place. This gentleman who was like their oldest member, and like quite an elderly man when they were founded in his 70s at the time. So he kind of stood out with all these other kind of young adults, or say people in their 30s and 40s, and it came out during, he actually was elected to the, I think that he never actually was formally sworn in at the Bundestag. I think if that's correct. Because
did he describe himself as the last true Marxist, just by any? No?
I don't think so.
Because he seems like the type of guy who would. I don't know. Anyway, go on. I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
Shut up, Alex. Interrupting our guest with your bullshit.
He seemed like a very unassuming young old man. Sorry, everyone kind of saw him as like this like grandfatherly figure, and he really had a kind of prominent intellectual place in the party. He was considered like the gray cardinal kind of figure. And So I think right at the at his height, when he was supposed to finally be sworn in and take office as like he was the oldest member of the Bundestag, or would have been, had he been allowed to take office. When the media dug up some information about his past, which was that he was a Nazi stormtrooper, and he later served in the Ministry of the Interior Ministry, the Nazi Interior Ministry in Berlin, and he fought on the Eastern Front. It was a Soviet prisoner of war. And then in 1954, I think, was released and went back to Germany. But I mean, he was like a very willing Nazi, very committed ideologically. I mean, serving in the Ministry of the Interior is no small thing. And the real incredible part is this is a pro-peace party, right? And this is that's like their whole thing is like green stuff, pedophilia, and like at this point in time, before they kind of switch and become pro-war, they were, and anti-nukes for end of the Cold War,
and really like mark a generational shift, right? Like, because you're saying that lots of young people really mark a generational shift, draw a line under everything pre-1945, and that we were trying to deal with our past and kind of
pacifism, like as a foreign policy for Germany without any kind of qualification or so it came out that he was this very committed Nazi, a Nazi official, and like it also turned out that he had told like at his Bundeslande, like at the level of the he had told like his party, like they hadn't made it public, but like many prominent Greens knew about it, and they just let him go ahead and run for office and be a face of the party and be in commercials. I don't know how they thought that was going to be hidden forever.
It's one of the weird kind of overlooked things, or at least maybe it's not talked about as much as I think it should be, is just also how far, the connection isn't accidental, how far the Nazis themselves kind of pioneered the green policies from, kind of animal friendly policies, cracking down on animal experimentation in favor of human experimentation eventually, but also their plans to kind of transform vast swathes of Eastern Europe into kind of effective nature reserves because all the people would have been killed or expelled. And that kind of, model. So as well as anti-pollution, pioneering anti-pollution and anti-smoking laws. So there is that connection between the Greens and the Nazis is it's ideologically, in terms of the development of political ideas, is a very genuine one and non-accidental, I think, ultimately, given the, the core of Nazism. And the way in which it views humanity's relationship to nature, and seeing humans ultimately as nothing more than kind of biological beings, also like a racial hierarchy that's essentially just Darwinian, and that there's nothing more to people than their role in nature. It's unsurprising.
Well, and that's maybe the pedophile stuff proves, humans are just destroyers and rapists, and we're here to prove that they are.
There's another. I think there's another explanation there. I was thinking about this actually. Like, what is the connection between? I'm not saying all like environmentalists are pedophiles, obviously, but like, is there a theoretical connection to the extent that you have a kind of, in some ways, a shared starting point of the the celebration of the innocence of youth, of the natural, and a kind of suspicion to I might be completely overthinking this, and
I think there's something there.
Upsetting any
go on.
Okay, I'm going to keep going.
No, because there's this sort of noble savage idea, right? Which I think environmentalists maybe hold to. And that's somehow here in terms of like the innocence of the child who is allowed to self-determine, and that, a kind of Rousseauian idea where outside of the constraints and discipline of schools and formal parenting and all the rest of it, if children are allowed to just express themselves and truly self-develop, that they will be more free and so on than civilizational man.
But they don't think kids are innocent. The premise of all of this kind of, all this overblown kind of theory of childhood self-determination that Lily talks about in her pieces, the premise is that they're not only have sexuality, which is like, a basic premise of psychoanalysis and Freudianism, but also that they're capable of self-determination and choosing for themselves.
But it has to be supplemented with a kind of a celebrate, like children have the right to choose, but also the environmentalist / pedophile, sorry, I don't mean that these two groups are the same, has to have some reason to celebrate the child. I think there is that, maybe that romantic shared starting point, but I feel like I'm probably just alienating a lot of listeners without contributing.
There's one group that we're not in risk of alienating, and this was, I thought, a really kind of weird cranny that you exposed in the course of the writing, which was in the course of the pieces you wrote, Lily, which was this about lesbian pedophiles, which is so kind of odd and strange, and again, contrary to the general, I suppose, assumption of pedophiles being men. Could you tell us a bit about this very odd corner of the German pedophile movement in the 60s?
Yes, this is one of the stranger kind of parts of the story for sure. I think I mentioned before that there were these communes that were to varying degrees linked to the Green Party, either directed by Green Party officials or where there was a lot of crossover with activists or people who lived there. And there was one all-female pedophile commune. They called themselves the Sewer Rats in Berlin in the early 80s. And, they had a manifesto, they had a publication, they participated in Green Party events, LGBT events, and attempted to, kind of help the gay and lesbian section of the predecessor to the German Green Party in West Berlin, called the Alternative List, to kind of lobby for the legalization of pedophilia. It's very, very strange because it's the only kind of example in anywhere, because I was looking for other examples of, say, political pedophiles that were women, that like actually had some kind of say organized like group, and then there was nothing else. And so it gets very, it's a little bit difficult to fully ascertain because there's so few, there's not that much out there, but up to the extent to which they were involved in pedophilia and how much of it was sort of provocative advertising to the outside world. I'm not saying that, there clearly were female pedophiles involved, and there clearly are female pedophiles in the world, but just there is some discussion and one of these like very obscure, dry German reports about, pedophilia in Berlin in the 80s, between the 70s and to present, that just came out, I think, last year, where they kind of talk about how, we don't know the extent to which there was actual, pedophilia, but there were some. And you can see from in my piece about female pedophile commune, the female pedophile in the Sewer Rats, they speak very openly about like a girl's sexuality, and they interrupt this big event as a kind of a not a Stonewall, but like a real historic, pivotal kind of gathering of gays and lesbians in West Germany, that kind of like it's the very, very beginning of the era of AIDS, and these lesbian pedophiles kind of interrupted it and broke up this event where it was, they were shouting about, look, little girls have a sexuality. Why are gay men dominating the debate about, gay and lesbian rights, and gay men's sexuality is just like, as oppressive as heterosexuality and that kind of thing. And then it was very divisive for the gay and lesbian movement at the time, apparently. Sorry, I think one of the things that you quoted in the article, which I think was pretty striking, is gay sexuality is also like adult heterosexuality, atomic bomb sexuality, which is what at this 1980 rally in Bonn, which was then the capital of West Germany. So what did they mean by that? I mean, is it because it's interesting that kind of like
anti like atom bomb kind of line comes in.
Anti-nuclear, and pro-pedophile and anti-nuclear. I wish we could say that all anti-nuclear people were pro-pedophilia, but probably not.
I just want to make clear that this podcast is very much pro-nuclear and anti-pedophile. So, exactly. We're on the right side of history, I think. Exactly. It's not a difficult barrier, but, still.
It's so weird to read some of this stuff because it's, I don't know, you can't even really imagine the way that people talk or it's hard for me to imagine like the atomic bomb being like this, meaning what it must have meant in Germany when during the Cold War, so in West Germany with like East Germany not so far away, and so I think when they said like that homosexuality or like adult gay homosexuality is atomic bomb sexuality, I think what they meant is like it's also very destructive. It's the same kind of anti-authoritarian language. Like they were. I only included one passage of that, but it's a very long, rambling kind of interruption that they interrupted this event in Bonn, and these women from this all-female commune. And
what's interesting, I thought, was how you pick up on the fact that what they did was generally to try and hijack discussions about equalizing age of consent laws.
Yeah.
So efforts to equalize age of consent between for homosexuals as they were then for heterosexuals, because they were generally older for men than they were for straight couples, and so they aimed, according to what you've put down, is they basically aimed to kind of intervene in those debates in order to make the case for abolishing consent laws entirely.
That's right. I think that was one reason why, the gay community in West Germany was relatively easy for pedophiles to infiltrate, because the 1969 reform of the law on governing sexual contact between men it made the law, I think the age of consent was 21 for gay men and then 18 for heterosexuals. So that made it kind of easy for pedophiles to say, look, our cause is the same as yours here, this is how we're going to frame things. And also because I think, if I remember correctly, that the Nazis criminalized all homosexual contact, and that was also a way that pedophiles kind of infiltrated the gay rights movement.
Yeah, I mean, I can sort of see how they would see that as the joint opposition to those age of consent laws, the kind of gay rights angle, the kind of smuggled in pedophilia, and the opposition to nuclear power, to nuclear weapons, as a kind of total opposition to technical rationalizing a repressive society, which is what they saw. But it's kind of crazy. Like, I think that one of the quotes as well, which I wanted to pull out, which you put in your article, is that the US and the USSR will keep rearming, and the gays can't excuse me, and the gays can't get rid of that with their sexuality. There needs to be a whole new kind of sexuality. So just gay liberation wouldn't be enough to explode the whole techno-rational civilization. You need to have
nuclear family has to be destroyed. Yeah, exactly.
And it's quite mad, that kind of jump from the kind of most intimate sphere all the way to kind of geopolitics in one go. And there's kind of almost very little political mediation between them. It's which is why you can kind of see that kind of cultural radicalism comes to stand in for any other political radicalism. In fact, that meeting which you described, where they kind of are so obviously disruptive, and this kind of pedophile group, it disrupts this pro-gay rights rally or meeting. It does sound like on one level, it sounds like a kind of CIA plant. It's like, get these kind of the wackiest lefty cultural radicals in and get them to disrupt left-wing meetings just by introducing all these sorts of any other claims about anything else, just to dissuade from the principal issue at hand. And so, at least it's comforting to know that it's a long-standing thing. That's been happening.
That's absolutely right. Yeah, I wonder. That's funny. You can
think of that famous video of the DSA meeting where people are like making these points of privilege and all that kind of thing. It's just completely disruptive. Sure. And distracting and so on.
I definitely thought of that. I just hadn't thought about the CIA component, about like CIA like funding like pedophiles, but I definitely thought of the GSA.
Yeah, I'm not saying that happened, but it's imaginable. Yeah.
So yeah. I mean, but don't you think they've, you know, in that specific claim been proved correct? The US will keep rearming, can't get rid of that with their sexuality. You've seen those kind of memes of like the planes dropping bombs, and then they have the one on the top, and then the one on the bottom has like the rainbow flag. It's like, well, yeah, I mean, who actually thought that this could happen?
The pedophiles are right, George, basically you're saying.
I'm just a neutral observer. If it's a correct point, I will credit that as a correct point. Which, you know, I think
Well, give it time. You might see like a meme eventually with an Ambler flag on the B-52. You know, who knows? Like, you know.
Oh, that's good. Well, that's our image for this episode anyway.
Another 50 years of culture war could take us anywhere. Who knows?
What's wrong with the North American Marlon Brando lookalike association? That's that's an old bad South Park joke. Sorry.
Anyway, so we're breaking taboos. We're going to come on to the Greens breaking another taboo around war in just a second. But listener, you're already subscribed to our Patreon because you're listening to this. But I would like to make a plea for you to rate and review us wherever you get your podcast. That'd be very nice, and it will help bring in new listeners. And also, if you've not yet got your copy of the End of History, which came out last year, you might want to pick up a copy. You might think you know everything you know about Bunga thought, but you might be surprised. And also follow us on social media. Tell your friends in real life or on the internet. One little other announcement. You'll have seen that these local BungaCast reading clubs are popping up. Lots of you have already come forward looking to set ones up in the following cities. So in Europe, in Amsterdam, Berlin, Dublin, Leipzig, London, Milan, Stockholm, and Tallinn. And then in North America, in Chicago, LA, New York, Philadelphia, Portland, Oregon, Seattle, San Francisco in the Bay Area, Vancouver, Southern New England, encompassing Boston, and Winnipeg, Canada. So if you're in any of those and would like to join up with other BungaCast listeners and join the reading club and follow along our syllabus for 2022 around those three themes that we have, get in touch with us at info@bungacast.com. Or if there's another city which isn't listed and you feel like you want to get together with other listeners and discuss the readings, also let us know and we'll try to put you in touch with other people. Anyway, so as to those taboos, I think one of the things that struck me reading the kind of the four pieces that you've written on the German Greens, Lily, is that there's on the one hand this deranged radicalism, which we've just been talking about. And at the same time, or something that maybe comes a little bit later, especially into the 90s, is an almost pathological fixation on maturity. And maturity is like, for the Greens, is let's be the grown-ups in the room. Let's abandon the old wacko radicalism, opposition to nuclear power, opposition to war, and be, you know, the serious adults in the room who do the serious adult things like bombing other countries. And that's quite a remarkable turnaround. So maybe you can describe to us, just to start off with, how that transformation happens. And I guess it's over the course of the 90s, really, this movement from a pacifist party to a pro-war one.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think it mirrors kind of a process that was happening with other sections of the left, you know, people who are maybe, if there's anyone older than me here, maybe you would know about it. But the war in Yugoslavia, the breakup of Yugoslavia being kind of a pivotal moment for the left with respect to war. And this, and I think the Greens are like kind of the most exemplary of this transformation. Although I would, just in response to what you said about sort of the process of growing up, becoming pro-war, I do agree with that. But I think there's also an attempt to make war almost an activist kind of expression of activism and of radicalism. So it wasn't just about like, okay, we're growing up and we're no longer pacifists. That's definitely part of it. But I think there was also an attempt to kind of, like I said, to kind of the grown-up thing was to go to war, but it's also the activist thing to do, the pro-human rights thing to do. And almost it was like kind of a radical use of power. You know, they saw use of power. They saw it as kind of a way of fighting nationalism and fighting power. Okay, so What happens? The breakup of Yugoslavia, Daniel Cohn-Bendit was very early on a critic of, a very strong critic, as most reasonable people were, of a lot of atrocities are being committed by Serbs in Bosnia. And I think that quite early on, maybe 1993, he started to advocate for some kind of intervention. And there was some hesitation among other corners of the party, a lot of resistance, of course, because the Greens' kind of heritage was pacifism. And it's also important to remember, that this is the immediate aftermath of Germany's reunification. So, after Germany reunited, it was basically agreed across the political spectrum that Germany's foreign policy should be entirely pacifist. That Germany should not commit to any troops outside of NATO anywhere. And so this was as the decade wore on and the Kosovo War started. I think that a lot of pressure was put on different people to take a stand and to decide what they were going to support. And so at this point, you kind of see this transformation where the left no longer kind of refers to wars that the US would like to get involved with by referencing the Vietnam War, but they start referencing World War II. So that's the kind of the touchstone, do we want this to happen again? Instead of we don't want to get involved in another Vietnam, it becomes we want to prevent another a Holocaust. And so this has an extra important meaning, obviously, in Germany. And so instead of the idea that Germany getting involved in a war is Germany becoming more nationalistic, it's we're going to join NATO, this post-nationalist institution that has, multiple, many European countries and North American countries, and we're going to defeat nationalism instead of become more nationalistic. And so they're able to kind of reimagine what war means, basically. And I think, and if I read the kind of some of the speeches at the time made by the advocates of bombing Serbia, you see this sort of almost a sense Germany, will cease to be the Germany of the 40s. Germany will be defenders of human rights rather than the people who commit mass atrocities. Will stop atrocities rather than being the people who commit them. And it's almost like this new role for Germany, being the defender of human rights in Europe and taking the lead and lending real moral force to this idea of humanitarian war. And I think that you can't even, there's no way to sort of underestimate how important that was. They really in Europe lent this kind of progressive face to and almost left approved stamp of approval to war.
Yeah, it must be, I think also it's a very kind of paradoxical inversion of German nationalism, because essentially it's a moment of redemption for the German nation, like you say. No longer are they the ones who are associated with genocide and atrocities and war in Europe, but rather those sins can be cast off onto the enemy. In this case,
it's like bad dialectics. It's like bad dialectics. You have imperialism, war, and atrocities. You have the negation of that through, pacifism, anti-nuclear, whatever. And then you have the transcendence of that, the Aufhebung, through humanitarian war and post-national nationalism, which is what Germany does in the EU as well. German interests pursued through the language of post-nationalism, telling other people, hey, you're not being European, you're being too nationalist.
Right.
Yeah, but it's a German, but I suppose the point is it's still about kind of German national interest and German power taking a particular form, and that seems to me that it's a vital part of the story, but crawling out from underneath the opprobrium of the Holocaust, but doing it also in a part of Europe in which the Germans had been so cruel and barbaric in their treatment of the civilian population and in the conduct of the war, in the Second World War itself,
Right.
is itself, tremendously striking. The fact that they were able to kind of effect that transformation. It'd be, and the comparison to Vietnam is also apposite to some degree because, in a way, I think the partisans' defeat of the Germans in the 40s is akin to the Vietnamese defeat of the Americans. And so there was also, there is also in the pursuit of that conflict, there is also pursuit of a historic, attempting to kind of reverse a historic defeat, essentially. Just as it would have been if the Americans went back to bomb Vietnam now. I think it would be the perversity of it would be very evident. But given the form that it took of humanitarian war and, like Lily says, kind of supported by the Greens, the perversity of it was if it disguised, at least in the case of German involvement in the NATO bombing.
Yes, it certainly was, I think, received by a lot of people in Serbia that way. And I was reading some WikiLeaks emails from a Stratfor analyst about the German Greens, as a Serbian analyst working for Stratfor. And it was just fascinating. He's trying to convince his American and other nationalities, colleagues from Stratfor, of what the meaning of the Greens is, of being back in power. This is 12 years ago, but they were already kind of starting to make some gains in elections. And he says, once that taboo on war is removed, that it's not going to go back. And he said, it didn't matter that the war to Serbs, it didn't matter that the war is being waged for human rights. It was the Germans are back like they were on April 6, 1941, and he said it doesn't matter if it's for fascism or for Nazism, for human rights, like it's bombs and falling. And so that's very much the sentiment that I feel from people in Serbia, that they feel very much marked by that particular political club in Germany, specifically the Greens. Yeah.
And there's one individual in particular who's been instrumental to all of this, and that is the former German foreign minister and senior Green, Joschka Fischer, who you mentioned earlier as having the photos of himself beating up a riot cop in the 60s, and that this was one of the photos that was leaked at the same time as Daniel Cohn-Bendit's discussions of his sexual encounters with children. So could you tell us a bit about Fischer and why his role has been so important in terms of transforming the Greens and in particular breaking this taboo around militarism?
Yes, as you said, Joschka Fischer was a former student activist, a very prominent one, and he was also one of the founders of the Green Party and became foreign minister when the Greens came to power in 1998. They were in the government for the first time then, and so he was the most popular politician in Germany, from what I understand. He had a tremendous amount of popular support. And he ended up kind of being the kind of conscience of the Greens. There's a pivotal kind of conference that I write about in my 4th article about the Greens, where it's just dedicated exclusively to the Kosovo War and to the position that the German Greens are going to take. This is actually after the bombing has already started, and the Greens have to decide if they're going to vote stop the bombing immediately. And that means that the coalition, the last time they were in a traffic light coalition with SPD, is going to then collapse, or they're going to say, this is the kind of a more kind of compromise solution that ended up passing, which is that temporary cessation of bombing, and that would have permitted the coalition to continue. It was certainly not what NATO would have wanted, but it was still going to, and it would ultimately mean that the bombing was going to continue. So this was a kind of real pivotal moment for the Greens. They basically vote to allow the war to continue, to allow the bombing to continue. And so about a third of the members left the party, and there was a big violent confrontation in before the third of members leave. There's like Joschka Fischer is pelted with red paint at this conference. There are police outside, mass protests, people likening Joschka Fischer to Hitler, calling him a warmonger. So just this, crazy scene. And Joschka Fischer at this conference, I'm sorry, I'm jumping all over the place, and I already told you how they vote, but first, let me back up because I'm remembering now. He gives this speech before they vote about the task at hand and what's at stake. And this is really remembered by a lot of people in the liberal interventionist community and Atlanticists and just kind of liberals in the United States as being kind of one of the most important speeches by a German politician ever. And I read last year, right around the time of the election, that from all kind of newspapers and people who are very much looking at what Germany is going to do, say in the EU neighborhood, so down here in the Balkans, talking about this speech is like giving them chills and really kind of being like this very, very moment that it's very strange for me, to see people kind of talk about war that way. But yeah, so anyway, this conference, the party ends up voting for war. A third of their members go. That's mostly people on the left and real dedicated pacifists, people who've been with the party since 1980. And then the party really takes after the taboo is gone on war, then everything can go. They abandon any kind of pretense to, mildly redistributionist policies, and they become very pro-business, and that just continued to the present day. And Joschka Fischer, I don't know, I have a lot to say about this man, but he's, becomes Madeleine Albright's favorite person, really.
Yeah.
Both of them are really pushing for war against the Serbs. And now today they're in business together. He's a consultant for one of Madeleine Albright's many kind of emerging market investment kind of companies, and they are bidding on Kosovo's telecommunications company, which is, even the New York Times, which tends to be quite sympathetic to these people, says that, that these are Kosovo's liberators who are now expecting to be able
cash in.
Yeah.
Yeah. Perfect.
Yeah.
There's a great quote you've got in the piece from I think it's Joachim Jochnow, where the quote is discussing Fischer. As with every step in Fischer's career, self-advancement was marketed as a painful realization of higher truths, whose acceptance did not mean betraying, but rather more perfectly fulfilling one's ideals for a better society.
Exactly.
I think that's the single best, most succinct account of the 1968 left.
And it's amazing how much of a thread there is, because I've read other things about the German Greens which make a similar point. So one article in Damage by Bernhard Pirkel about the new German vice chancellor, the Green Habeck. The new vice chancellor once wrote a play about one of the most fateful figures in German history, the Weimar politician Gustav Noske, who sent in the army to suppress the communists. In that play, this fictionalized play, the difficult choices Noske faced are explored with great empathy. The self-branding is clear here. Here's a sensitive intellectual who sees the bigger picture, but is not afraid to make brutal decisions, as long as they're in line with the interests of the ruling class. And it's just great. It's just this whole sequence of self-justification through this appeal to sort of maturity ethic of no, we're the serious people now. But also these are the real way to realize our aims. And it's funny because it's something that you see also you can see with Blairism, for example, no, this is the real way to realize laborism. Actually, we just need to basically give ourselves up to the market entirely, and then we'll have a little bit more money to fund the NHS or whatever it might be. And it's these are the way to truly realize our aims instead of bombing Kosovo or whatever. It's amazing.
So fascinating. I read one piece from the 90s about how the German Greens had actually been the only party, or in Germany, where in which people weren't entirely pacifist before that. In one instance, they believed in, say, using some level of street violence against, say, Nazis or against the police. And there was this idea that this kind of willingness to resort to, say, punch Nazis, this kind of thing, actually was used to then justify war. Like it's that same kind of willingness,
right.
Kind of did it. Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah, street fighting is the same as dropping bombs or whatever.
Dropping
like
bombs.
NATO.
NATO dropping bombs. Yeah,
it's just being more mature and more efficient. If punching one Nazi is good, then bombing a whole load of people committing human rights violations must be even better. It's just economies of scale,
right? And the whole
special
kind of
liberty
Nazi can be very kind of can be. I mean, that's obviously like a debate, but then all you have to do is kind of define your enemies, whoever they are, as Nazis, and then you can kind of justify doing anything to them.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, even how much, and in fact, I mean, I think there's probably something to be written about this, but even today, I mean, it's remarkable, I think, how much the fall of Yugoslavia still kind of haunts so many discussions in so many different contexts. I mean, so I was just reading about Barbara, what's her name? The woman who just published, the political scientist from UCSD, I think, who's just published the book about the prospect of civil war in the States. And Barbara Walter? And she talks about so American political scientist Barbara Walter, and she talks about the prospect of civil war in the States. And again, the model is Yugoslavia, the disintegration of Yugoslavia with Trump cast in the role of Milosevic. And it's, the strangeness of that comparison, really kind of speaks volumes. Taking 1980s Yugoslavia and imagining that could be transplanted to the States or, to any other kind of major Western country is so odd.
Where in the US is Serbia? Like,
I was going to ask, is it going to be
the
New England Slovenes?
State, right?
Is it going to be the New England Slovenes who secede first?
That makes sense.
Yeah, I think that maps, right?
Maybe California. California, the rich state. So they want to break away from paying for all the poor all the poor rednecks, right? So that would be the way it would go, right? So they didn't want to, like Slovenes and Croatians didn't want to pay for Kosovars and Macedonians and Serbs. So they break away because they're richer. And then it turns out, obviously, much later that they were built around those markets. I imagine, it'd be the same thing in the States. California and New York would find very quickly, that it'd be difficult to separate away from the hinterland that they depend on economically. But anyway, I mean, it's only to say, I think that the different kind of roles that Yugoslavia plays in contemporary liberal visions of politics is really something. And I'm amazed that it's still being trotted out to serve, all sorts of purposes and in such kind of vastly different contexts. So not to make the case for humanitarian war anymore or kind of refighting World War II, but now making the case about Trump. But again, the same kind of transplants are made with respect to, kind of it's fascism again, but this time it's kind of ethnic fascism, but it's in America. And I mean, it's also weird and convoluted. Anyway,
so maybe just a
sidebar.
Yeah, just to wrap this up and to get the idea of Serbia as Missouri out of my head, I wanted to ask about
Alabama. Surely Alabama.
Yeah, isn't that Montenegro? Let's not do this. We can do this another time. This would be fun. Actually, talking about the Greens now who are in government in Germany. I wondered, Lily, if you have a read on kind of what their term in office is going to be like. I mean, I just obviously don't think, and maybe Phil, correct me, but I don't think there's an appetite for that form of humanitarian war anymore. So I don't really see the Greens leading the bombing campaigns, but at the same time, I'm kind of curious what their role is going to be.
They're certainly prioritizing the transatlantic relationship, as they did in 1998. Ahead of the election, Annalena Baerbock was, appearing at Atlantic Council events, and she has said that the Greens' foreign policy is led by human rights. That's what guides them. That's kind of what makes them distinct from, say, Merkel. And so they've vowed to and they've already kind of started this. and get tough on China and get tough on Russia. I mean, they're opposed to Nord Stream. This is a little bit difficult because SPD is much more accommodating towards Russia, and of course they're in coalition. But so very critical of say so like human rights in Russia, and they've also been trying to unsuccessfully so far get the EU to impose sanctions on Milorad Dodik in Bosnia, Bosnian Serb leader. So generally, some of the same kind of say enemies as those of the US. So I kind of in my articles and I emphasize this. This is basically Washington's Dream Party, because they have very similar kind of foreign policy orientation and very like the same enemies, but they kind of have a kind of fresh green, say almost more progressive or
that new car smell, new electric car smell.
Right, exactly. Yes. And I think that Merkel, she did have she had the older generation's attitude about the war taboo for Germany. She was very much more kind of, I don't want to use the word accommodating, but because that's what the Atlanticists use. But she was much more kind of friendly or willing to work with Russia, and the Greens are much more kind of antagonistic, from what I understand. But I'm sure that you guys have something to say about that, Phil, perhaps.
It's interesting what you say about how they're kind of pushing the Atlanticist agenda with respect to the Balkans and with respect to Russia. It's hard to imagine that there's any kind of another new Western war on the horizon. But never underestimate their lust for war, like the pedophiles' lust for kids. So they've, and I thought, war wasn't going to happen. They wouldn't go to war again after Iraq, and then they bombed Libya, So I think, it doesn't seem likely, but on the other hand, I wouldn't underestimate the opportunity for some of that smattering of glory from a quick bombing campaign seems to be irresistible to Western politicians over the last 30 years. So who knows?
Totally possible. I know that the Greens have said, or Annalena Baerbock said that, it's Germany's history means that it has to kind of protect Ukraine's territorial integrity. So now they're kind of using Germany's historical responsibility based on its past to defend, its allies. So it's this kind of interesting, like, shift which we discussed before, how instead of Germany's kind of historical responsibility being rooted in experience of like being an aggressor and needing to be pacifist in face of as a response, and now it needs to be kind of more aggressive.
Germany's future is to be found on the Asian steppes. That sounds totally fine. That sounds totally cool.
If you're talking about responsibility to protect, like globally, then Germany has more responsibility than anyone else. They've got as much as is required.
They'll take over the world. They'll take over the world while they're apologizing for it.
All right, maybe we should leave this here. Thank you so much, Lily. You're always welcome on BungaCast anytime. This has been a lot of fun. Listeners, you should sign up and subscribe to Lily's Patreon. It's patreon.com/Lily S. Lynch. Very good stuff on there about kind of global affairs, but especially about Eastern Europe, I suppose. And so people should sign up.
And also about the Greens. So I think the takeaway. What I get from this is the Greens, they're Nazis, they'll bomb you, they'll fuck your kids, and they'll probably turn off the central heating once they've abolished nuclear power too. So I think that's my takeaway from this session anyway.
Great takeaway.
Very good.
Perfect.
All right. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Lily, and we'll see you next time. Catch you later. Bye-bye.